Hello, and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll learn about the legendary railroad baron James J. Hill. But first, joining us now on the set is our guest for today, an author, Jamie Parsley. Jamie, thanks so much for joining us today.
It is great being here.
Well, now you're here today to talk about your new book a little bit, The Downstairs Tenant and Other Stories, some short stories, I think. But before we do that, before we get started, tell the folks a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. I was born here in Fargo, raised just north of West Fargo in Harwood, North Dakota. Went to school there, both in Harwood, graduated from high school in West Fargo. Went out to Vermont for graduate school, and then went to seminary in Wisconsin, came back, and here I am, still in Fargo. And I love it here.
Yeah, well, with that said, now, so what got you interested in writing? When did you first start writing?
Actually, it was in high school, at West Fargo High School. I was in my sophomore year. I had a great English teacher who was incredible. She introduced me to American literature, which was a little different than what I sort of associated with poetry and even fiction, I guess, to some extent. But she introduced me to poets like William Carlos Williams and Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. And it really opened up a whole new world for me, a whole new, just something very exciting as far as poetry was concerned. And that was sort of the seed that was planted that, that sort of motivated me to be writing poetry.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's it. You're currently the Associate Poet Laureate of North Dakota.
One of them, yes.
One of them,
yes.
Since 2004, I believe.
Right.
Can you tell us about that?
Yes, Larry Wywody, who is the Poet Laureate of North Dakota, was looking for some associates. He wanted to make sure that there would be a time in North Dakota where there would never be there would never be no poet laureate in the state of North Dakota. And so he was looking at people that he knew who were writers, a real diversity of people in this state to represent the true diversity that we do have in this state, and picked associates from those, and I was lucky to be one of them. And it has been a great honor for me, and I like working with him and working with my other fellow associate poet laureates.
Yes,
so.
and of course we've had Larry here on the show.
Yes,
so.
he's a great guy.
When did you realize that you had actually talent as a writer? Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe it was sophomore in West Fargo.
Well, I started writing shortly after I started reading a lot of poetry. Probably the time when I sort of thought maybe I might have something was I was probably a senior in high school. A little bit after that, I was 18, and I didn't know any other living poets. All the poets that I, of course, had been experiencing were long dead. And I did hear about a poet who lived here in Fargo-Moorhead by the name of Mark Vins. And he was, he had just published a book. There was an article that had been done on him in the Binford Guide, which was very popular back in those days. And so I wrote to him out of the blue. I was sort of pretentious in doing that, I suppose. I look back now. And he and I sent him poems. I sent him a letter and I sent him poems, and they were probably horrible, horrible poems. But he was so gracious in his response to me, and he said something in his response that really inspired me. And that was, he said, "You understand what a poem is and how it works," which is very rare, he said, sometimes with beginning poets. And that was enough to just kind of motivate me to continue forward. I learned to experiment with style and with form, and that was sort of the motivating factor for me, and I was able to move on from there. I started submitting poetry to journals, and they were getting published. My first book was published when I was 22, so those were kind of my first clues that maybe I could do this. So.
Well, with that said, can you tell us about some of your other books? And
sure.
Of course, including Fargo 1957,
Right.
and a lot of people may recognize that one.
Right. So. I published 12 books of poetry. This is my first book of fiction that I published. And those I've been publishing since, as I said, I was 22. That was in 1992. And so mostly poetry, and I've really enjoyed, publishing and writing poetry. And some of those poems, some of the themes of those books have been definitely based on North Dakota, based on my my growing up here and the fact that I do find a lot of poetry right here in this state. But also some of it comes from personal experiences. The book that came out the same year as The Downstairs Tenant, I published another book that same year, a book of poems about my father's death 5 years ago. I published a book dealing with a diagnosis I had with cancer when I was 32. So I write about a full range of things in those books.
Well, could you maybe read a portion from Fargo 1957?
Certainly. When this book came out, when I was working on this book, one of the things that I found sort of exciting was I really didn't know where this book was going to go as a whole. And finally, I started finding these voices, the voices of the victims who died. There were 12 people who died, including my mother's cousin and her husband. And so I started finding these voices in the book, in the poems, and that was sort of the cohesiveness of this book, those voices. And it was exciting for me because what I was able to do was to do something a nonfiction historian can't do with this same historic event. Nonfiction historian can't give voices to the dead. I mean, possibly could, but not in the same way a poet could. And so I was able to do this, and they came alive for me, and that was really where the book sort of came together. And so the poem I'm going to read is a poem that I put in the voice of my mom's cousin Betty Teachin, who was killed. Well, she died. She was in a coma. She died a couple of years afterward without regaining from the coma. And so this is a poem in her voice, and it's called Her Prayer. And this is in Betty Teachin's voice. Don't let me fall. Let me not fall through the long night as a stone falls to the hard ground. Don't let my hands chafe and blister in the high dry winds and peel like bark from trees. Don't let me fall as the wind beats leaves from the trees and scatters them across the grass. When the angry storm rises and kicks up dirt from the earth, screaming at me in the long dust, don't let me be like a fly, shivering and grasping at the glass pane as autumn dies. Don't let me fall. Throughout my short life, I have asked for so much. Let me rather be like a seed that falls from a grass blade in the park near the house I grew up in. Like that seed, let me flourish, and then let me die, quietly and unnoticed, in some future dusk. And in that moment, sow in me your breath, as seeds are sown in the warm, fresh-tilled earth.
Mm. Very nice. Well, and now something that our audience may not know here. Can you tell us about your job as a priest?
Yes.
In charge of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church?
Right. I've been an Episcopal priest for 11 years. Has also probably been a vocation that I have been pursuing since high school, actually a little earlier than high school. I was 13 years old when I first wanted to become a priest. And it has been very much goes hand in hand with my vocation as a poet to some extent. A lot of things go back and forth between the two, and there's kind of an enmeshing between the two, which I found pretty exciting, actually.
But are a lot of people surprised when they find out sort of a priest and an author?
I think so. It has been interesting sometimes. People either will see you as one or the other, and it's easy to sort of compartmentalize both of those vocations. And so people either will know me specifically as a priest or specifically as a poet, but very rarely as the two. So I've worked hard to kind of bring the two together without inflicting too much of my poetry on my parishioners, certainly in sermons, let's say, on a Sunday morning.
Well, you know, obviously now we've done a lot of talking about you and about your books, but you came here to talk a little bit about your new book, and you said it's the first short stories you've written.
Right.
So again, interesting, the Downstairs Tenants and other stories. Tell us about what it's about, or kind of set us up on it.
Sure. I've actually been writing short stories probably as long as I've been writing poetry. Again, it was one of those sort of interesting things where I loved to work on, take different experiences and try to work them in different forms. So poetry is a form, fiction is a form. Sometimes things don't work as a poem, So you work it into a short story, let's say, and that's where a lot of these came from. These go back probably about 20, 25 years, some of these stories. And so I was able, in some of the areas where these stories didn't work as poems, they came out in fiction.
Well, with that said, can you talk, maybe you talked a little bit, but more specific, what is it that sort of interested you in writing about Fargo and the area in the mid-20th century?
Well, I think, when I was growing up, especially my father's generation, it seemed, they were really enraptured about the pioneer era. For some reason, my father's generation just loved that era. Well, for my generation, it was the mid-20th century, the 50s, were just fascinating to me. Ever since I was probably can remember. There was sort of a romantic attitude about the 50s, especially those people who had lived through it. It was sort of an idyllic time for them. And so I think that had a lot to do with my appreciation of the 50s. I didn't live through it, so I could maybe romanticize it a little bit. And it always stayed there. And so I found myself writing a lot about it. Of course, Fargo 1957 was sort of the main catalyst in it, but then these stories, of course, sort of came out in the midst of that as well. And they were all, they all take place in that time. So it just kind of happened that way.
Well, with that said, and I realize short stories are just that, short stories. But could you read from one of them for us?
I certainly can. The story, I'm just going to share a couple of paragraphs from the final paragraphs from a story called Leland Franken's Bible. And it was a story about a hired hand who comes to a farm, and he was a little bit of a religious fanatic. And the young son who lives on the farm is a sort of a skeptic. And so by the time the end of the story comes along, Leland, the farmhand, has died. The skeptical son finds the Bible and has a sort of weird religious experience as a result of it. And so the end of the story, and this takes place in 1961, and at the end of the story, his mother is coming down, and she's surprised by the reaction her son has to finding this Bible and Leland Franken's death. So this is the last couple of paragraphs from Leland Franken's Bible. His mother came down the stairs and was about to go to Raymond's bedroom, which was on the main floor, to make his bed when she heard him. She quickly made her way to the kitchen. "Raymond," she called as she approached the doorway. "Is that you?" "And they were judged every man according to their words," he intoned as he hunched over the Bible. "I almost didn't recognize your voice," his mother said as she entered the kitchen. "It didn't sound like you at all." "And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire." He held the loose page from the Bible up in front of his face without looking at her. "Raymond," she called out. She crossed the kitchen and stood just beside him. "What are you doing?" She reached out, trying to grab the page from his hand, but he jerked it away from her and kept on reading, his voice overtaking hers. "And whosoever was not found in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire." Only then did Raymond stop reading. He looked up at his mother, nodding and smiling slightly. "Amen," Raymond intoned defiantly as he stared his mother down, and "Amen." Then, his elbows on the table, he bowed his head and buried his face in his hands, his lips moving slightly. "Are you praying?" his mother asked as she stood over him. But even as she asked the question, she felt herself smile, because, of course, she knew better.
So, what's been the reaction so far to the book?
There hasn't been much of a reaction, surprisingly. The people who have read it said they've enjoyed it, but the stories aren't typical. The influence of people like Flannery O'Connor, who came from Georgia, she was very much a part of my influences on this particular book. And so I think if you're familiar with those kind of stories, then this kind of book will mean a little something. If you're not, the stories come across maybe as a little dark and, the term that was used was gothic.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of how it is. As much as the 1950s could be gothic, I think this is about what it would be like. So, and I think that people kind of react accordingly. to that.
Well, you bring that up. So what is Prairie Gothic?
Well, I think the way you could describe it is Prairie Gothic would be a darker tone to these stories. Again, I think as I was being raised, as I said earlier, the 50s always seemed sort of like this idyllic kind of, perfect kind of pink and gray era, so to speak. And to be writing about a little darker side of it, which did exist and was very much a part of all eras. I mean, we all have those eras in our history. To be writing about that, of course, gives it that flair. And I think Prairie Gothic certainly has been something that's always existed. I think you find that even maybe in Louis L'Amour and some of those earlier writers who were writing about maybe the darker side of what it was like to live here. So, yeah.
Well, and maybe this is related, but what is it about this region that sort of lends itself to writing about it?
Well, it's a unique area. It really is. And I think people who don't think it is haven't lived here. It is a beautiful area. There is such a blend of people and nationalities and everything here in North Dakota. And I don't think enough people have tapped the creative resources that exist here. That, it is a beautiful state, and there's a lot going on here.
What are your challenges sort of in everyday life as a priest in sort of these challenging times, and do you ever have any conflicts in your writing with that relationship?
Well, I think as a priest, the conflicts are, I have to deal with a pretty hectic schedule in my parish at times, and oftentimes it's difficult to find time to write in that. I'm very disciplined, very, very disciplined. So I wake up in the morning, very early in the morning, and I at least write every day for 1 hour. That's just, very important to me. And so in that sense, I think in my own personal life, that's the issue I have to deal with often. I think in the larger world, dealing with so many of the things that happen in life and trying then to process it, both as a priest and as a writer, that is always a challenge. It's always going to be a challenge. How do we take what's going on in the world and deal with it? And there's a perfect example of how my vocations as both priest and poet kind of work well together, because there's no way that I can write about certain things without being somewhat influenced by my priestly vocation to some extent, or vice versa. It makes it interesting. It makes it kind of different than maybe some other people's. And I'm very unapologetic about that, though.
Do you have any advice for young writers out there?
I say read. Read is very important. You need to read a lot. And I would much prefer seeing people reading some of those poets and be inspired by those poets than maybe starting to write first and read later. That's what often happens. So I say, no, read first, learn the craft of poetry, and then go forward from there if you're inspired to do that.
Okay. Well, with that said, if people want a copy of your new book, or for that matter, even your other books,
right,
where can they go? Who can they contact?
For both Fargo 1957 and The Downstairs Tenant, both of those, of course, were published by the Institute of Regional Studies at NDSU, and they can be, of course, ordered on their website. At Zanbro's here in Fargo, and several bookstores, they can be special ordered. And all of my books can be found on my website, which is jamieparsley.com.
No. Jamie, thanks so much for joining us.
This was
today.
wonderful. I really had a good time.
Okay. Stay tuned for more. Known as the Empire Builder, James J. Hill was instrumental in settling the Great Plains. Wielding the vision of a transcontinental railroad, Hill recruited immigrants to settle along his rail lines to create a market for his company, bringing wheat east to the great mills and elevators, and shipping goods west to supply the ever-growing homesteaders. By the end of his life, Hill's economic dominance stretched from his headquarters in St. Paul to the Pacific Ocean.
He's one of those examples of rags to riches story that Americans love so much. It wasn't typical of the great industrial leaders of the Gilded Age, of which he was certainly one. Most people who made it big started out pretty big, but he was born into poverty in frontier Ontario. He had no backing. He had basically an 8th grade education. As a teenager, really, he left Canada, tried his luck or bummed around some of the Gulf ports, New York and elsewhere, and settled on St. Paul, probably for the reasons that most people who paid any attention in the mid-19th century knew. St. Paul's the high point of navigation on the Mississippi River. Fast developing, lots of opportunities, so it made some sense to try your luck there, and he was fortunate enough to be hired on the levee initially to work as a clerk and perform other duties in St. Paul. So he kind of stuck with it, if you will, and of course this part of the world started to grow economically very quickly afterwards. He was working really as a forwarding firm. Steamboats would come up the Mississippi and then they'd unload them and then they'd transfer those goods, that merchandise, to stores, people, and so on. A good part of his first fortune, some of it is made in the steamboat trade, some of it is made in the coal trade. He's fairly prominent and certainly well off by the time he enters the railroad business at middle age.
Hill was a great user of circumstance. When a panic or financial troubles would occur, the opportunity presented itself for Hill to acquire interest in these other businesses, and eventually simply built up a portfolio that was so big that he essentially controlled the market in the northern part of the United States.
Really, railroading for James J. Hill was a second career. He became aware of the importance of railroad personally. Everybody read the newspapers, and certainly he did too. He knew railroads were important. The railroads, what I think of as the glamour industry of the 19th century. The best minds, most of the money, the best science, the best managers, the best workers, the best everything went into the railroads.
Hill was interesting in that he used his own fortune. The Great Northern was not a land-grant railroad, so he did not have the advantage that other railroads had in that they were able to leverage the land given to them by the government. The strength of his will and his business acumen and his personal fortune built the Great Northern.
In the 1890s, all the transcontinentals except the Great Northern went bankrupt in the Panic of 1893. Hill, backed by J.P. Morgan, will get de facto control of the Northern Pacific. They will purchase a controlling interest in the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. All of these lines together, plus some smaller lines, will form the basis of what's about to become the Northern Securities Company. The day Northern Securities is formed, it immediately becomes the largest single railroad organization in the country. So in the rise of big business, this is pretty big stuff. Only U.S. Steel is larger than Northern Securities, so it's a huge enterprise.
Hill was a force to be reckoned with. He firmly believed that this should all be one humongous entity, one railroad, and that was his dream, and it was the dream of empire. He was a very driven individual. He had a very large house in St. Paul on Summit Avenue, and I think he had that house simply to keep up appearances, because I don't know how often he stayed in that house, because he was busy moving around his system, busy making sure things were happening the way he wanted them to.
He was, I guess, in what we would call in the 21st century, a workaholic. 7 days a week, he was very much on the ground, hands-on, saw in person what happened. If you think of some of the other great railroad leaders of the time, they almost never inspected the railroad properties anywhere. Hill was constantly on the railroad, his railroad, and particularly as it expanded, first to construct it to make sure things were going well, and then the operation of it to make sure things were running smoothly. He was a micromanager, I suppose, in our terms today. He had this kind of restless temperament that he was constantly building more and always involved in things. In one sense, even though he retired formally from the railroad, first as president and then as chairman of the board, in some ways he probably never really retired.
In 1916, when he died, the entire system, all his holdings, all of the trains, all the ships, everything, at a preordained time came to a halt. The engine crews dismounted, the ships came to a stop, observed 5 minutes of silence in honor of Mr. Hill. After his death, the railroad named their premier train after him as the Empire Builder. And even today, Amtrak preserves the name, the Empire Builder, for its passenger service across and on Great Northern's line. So in effect, you can still ride Hill's Dream even today.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse for this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funding for Minnesota Legacy programs are provided by a grant from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, and by the members of Prairie Public.